Hello again, it's Noob, and well, it's book review time. This is on locks and insecurity engineering, understanding and preventing design vulnerabilities in locks, safes, and security hardware by Mark Webber Tobias. This is over 600 pages dedicated to what makes a lock or associated lock hardware secure and what can go wrong in design. Essentially, it's an all-in-one manual that can be used for education, interest, and hopefully lock and hardware design improvement. And what is insecurity engineering? Well, as the author says in the simplest of terms, insecurity engineering is a lack of expertise and understanding of how locks work and the various ways you can make them fail. And for full disclosure, this copy of the book was kindly gifted to me to review and to keep by the author. I actually had a really wonderful conversation with Mark about this book and other subjects just before Christmas last year. So what topics does this book cover? Well, without just listing the chapter headings, loosely, chapters 1 to 4 review the main concepts of basic lock designs and critical problems lock manufacturers experience. Chapters 5 to 10 look at legal and regulatory issues. Chapters 11 to 13 give a brief history of locks, their designs and technologies. Chapters 15 to 20 cover a plethora of ways in which the vulnerabilities of locks from old to modern can be exploited. Chapters 21 to 24 give an insight into attacks on key control and keying systems. Chapters 25 and 26 provide case studies. And the remainder of the book is dedicated to design rules, axioms and guidelines, as well as the appendices. So it's genuinely quite hard to do a book review in a reasonable amount of time on a book this dense with interesting knowledge. So I'm just going to pick out a few things from a number of chapters which I think really kind of explain to you what the book is about and show you some of my favourite parts. Now, the book starts with looking at things like the primary responsibilities of lock manufacturers and then goes on to give some brief examples of some security engineering failures. So, for example, it talks about lock bumping here, shimming, impressioning, using things like paper clips to open wafer locks, and of course the classic attack on the Cabot Simplex 1000 using a massive neodymium magnet. One of the things that chapter 1 does really well is set the scene, and part of that is listing some of these basic engineering rules which should be thought about when designing locks. So things like locks are designed to be tested and attacked by bad guys, and you can't test against an attack if you have not envisaged the standards for testing. Mark actually lists 28 of these engineering rules, and all of them are very, very insightful. In chapter 2, the book lays down more foundational knowledge about the types of lock attacks, such as mechanical bypasses, brute force attacks, picking, noting of course that no mechanical lock is perfect in production, which is what us lockpickers exploit, hybrid attacks, keying systems, attacks against shear lines, etc, etc. Now, when I was reading this chapter, I initially thought that it's going quite light on the information, just sort of skimming over a lot of the concepts, which I think in essence it does. And I was desperately hoping that the book would go into a bit more detail. And, well, it really, really, really does. So anything you read in sort of chapter 1 and 2 is built upon in the following chapters. So I was a bit worried that it would be sort of kept at this high level, which is fine. But as somebody who understands a lot about locks and bypasses and things like that, I was learning new stuff for sure. But it wasn't sort of going to that detail that I was looking for. But it does sort of build on this knowledge. It's a nice foundation as we go forwards. Chapter 3 is dedicated to vulnerability assessments in lock designs, even providing a vulnerability assessment process, which is sort of a list of things which you need to consider when you're testing the vulnerabilities in a lock or lock system. And there is sort of wisdom and knowledge sort of throughout, just giving you sort of insights and things to think about, such as just because an employee can't compromise a security product means nothing. Now, I'm not going to spend too long on looking at part 2 of this book because it's in regard to legal and regulatory issues in locks, safes and security systems. Now, I'm not an expert in this area at all, but there's a lot of information in here and it's genuinely accessible and readable. But there aren't many images in this, and this is a YouTube video, so I'm sort of thinking that if you're interested in understanding the legal and regulatory ramifications of producing locks, being a lock manufacturer, what people should be beholden to, then this is a really, really good précis of that area. I certainly learned a lot with this, but I'm going to quickly move on to part 3, which is the basic designs and technologies for mechanical and electrical locks. Now, I have to say, when I first saw the cover of this book, I did not expect it to have such an interesting and concise history. Lock design. I mean, we go as far back as, early Greek door locks, the classic Egyptian pin tumblers, and this really awesome picture of the original pin tumbler lock design by Linus Yale, which is really, really cool to see. Of course, we move on to warded locks like this one and other designs. I mean, just look at the key there. Isn't that gorgeous? And of course, the book covers all your major lock types like your lever locks, your pin tumblers, your disc tumblers, wafer locks, all those kind of things in detail. And another surprise, I think the book's even spoiling us a bit here, is that it even has a whole section in chapter 12 about lock terminology. Now, this is of interest to anybody who's studying locks, locks as a hobby, locks as a job. It doesn't really matter because, it's maybe a little concise, but it has all the major terms that you will need to know about when it comes to locks, so you understand the language that's being used and what it means. So like pin stack or plug, what these terms mean. What is a sidebar, giving you nice diagrams throughout to show you what it actually means. This was really unexpected. I mean, it's quite a short little section, but what that information has in there is so valuable, especially if you're not so sure on what these terms mean. Remember what I said earlier, that the book builds on its previous chapters? This is a great example. We've already covered sort of a history of locks and some of the basic overviews of lock designs. Chapter 13 goes into much further detail about each type of major lock design. For example, wafer tumbler locks here, slider sidebar locks, disc detainers, dimple locks, or dimple locks including multi-axis dimple locks. And at this point, the book starts to introduce even more vulnerability exploits, like, for example, foil impressioning. The book is really comprehensive, even talk about tubular locks and locks with magnetic elements, and then going on to explore security enhancements for conventional locks, whether it's anti-bump pins, security pins that you might see in pin tumblers, false notches or gates on disc detainers, etc, etc. Now it's at chapter 15 we get to some of the juicy stuff that as a lockpicker I'm very interested in, which is attacks against locks then and now. And again, it goes into detail and builds on that detail. Of course, starting with those early warded locks and the warded lockpicks that were developed to defeat them. And this book covers so many interesting techniques such as lever lock foil impressioning, introduction to some of the KGB's interesting lock tools, including this fascinating KGB pin tumbler lock decoder, which probes each pin tumbler and the length of the bottom pin. I mean, what a design. I mean, there really must have been something in the water at that time, because the KGB even made a decoder for this type of magnetic padlock. I mean, just look at that thing. And here's a tool which I've always wanted to have a go on. I've never seen one in real life, and that is the awesome Sputnik lockpick, which in chapter 18 you can sort of see how it works with each one of these little probes operating a wire which can push up on each pin tumbler stack. Chapter 16 briefly talks about all of the different parts of a lock system that can be exploited for security testing or exploitation. Whether that's the shell, the housing, the plug, the keyway, the keys, credentials, the shear line, the gates, the sidebars, movable lock components, you name it, it's covered in this chapter. And we won't dwell on it, but chapter 17 does look at some destructive attacks against locks and related hardware, which is, I have to admit, quite interesting. Things like, of course, drilling locks and lock snapping and many other techniques, which I probably won't talk about here. More interesting for me, of course, are the covert methods of entry, such as lockpicking, which is well covered, but of course covers concepts like jiggling and snap guns, comb picking, impressioning, etc. For those interested, of course, there is a section on attacks against electronic locks. I found this chapter really interesting, but again, I'm not an expert, so I can't really talk to whether it's in sufficient detail or not, but it's a short chapter and interesting for, I think, the casual reader who's interested in this type of mechanism. Now, as interesting as all these previous chapters have been, I probably learnt the most new knowledge from chapters 20 to 24, where we're talking about advanced attacks against high security locks and all sorts of interesting things like attacks on key control and special keying systems and all these sorts of things which I just wasn't really aware of. Now, the detail in this sometimes went a bit above my head on areas which I didn't know much about. I probably should go back and read those sections a bit more slowly, but I'll try and pick out a few really interesting things that I really enjoyed reading about in these chapters. One fascinating topic explored in, for example, chapter 22 is all about using software to generate keys and key profiles just from things like pictures and other non-destructive tools. Just this whole area is genuinely just really interesting, and I think that over the years this will become more and more of the norm. It's quite a high-tech attack on a lock system, but it's genuinely fascinating, this whole chapter on how software can be used to identify locks, keys, even make keys from pictures just by using software. And what about scanning locks using probes, the output of which can give you information about the key bitting itself? And then, almost as a dessert, a cherry on the cake if you will, there are some real life case examples to explore at the back, which are incredibly interesting and just read like fascinating stories in some regard. So there you go. That was a very brief overview of this really interesting book, and I'm not sure that I managed to do enough justice to the 600 pages plus that are in this book, but I really hope that I did enough that you got a good idea of the flavour, the topics and concepts that this book actually covers. And there is a lot that it covers, as I hope you could tell. So who do I think this book would be of interest to? Well, I think primarily any lock manufacturer worth their salt should be reading this book, or probably this book and a lot more books like it, to understand, all the concepts around locks and insecurity engineering, exploits are out there, how to test a lock for security, what modern attacks are out there. I think there's just so many things that a lock manufacturer would get from a book like this. It's unbelievable. Security professionals, security testers, pen testers, physical security experts. This is a really, really good place, well, not only to start, but to provide depth to, I think, their field as well. Although I would be interested to know from any security experts, physical security experts, in the comments below, have you read this book? What do you think to this and other ones of Mark Tobias's? As a hobbyist, this is a really fascinating book. It covers so many topics. I mean, it has like history of locks, glossary of locks. It talks about different lock types. It's actually really good précis for a beginner to the lock picking, lock sport hobby or pen testing. I think it's a really good sort of place to start. Even it's not such at a level of detail that somebody who's interested in this area wouldn't be able to understand the majority of the things covered in this book. It's a lot of information, but it's a lot of good information, and I really like that. I certainly really enjoyed my time reading this book. I thought that maybe this would be a little bit too scholarly, a little bit dry, but that isn't the case, especially because there's lots of anecdotes throughout and stories, lots of interesting pictures, and I just think that the whole flow of the book is really good. Any criticism of this book? Well, I mean, not every chapter is going to be for everybody. I found the chapters on the legal side of things, whilst interesting, a little bit dry for me because it's just not my area of personal interest, but that's a small part of the book and still worth reading. I think that at the beginning of the book, if you don't understand that the book builds and builds and builds on the information presented, the first few chapters can seem a little bit light. I feel like they're glossing over some of the subjects, but that isn't the case if you read the whole book. The book starts out with those kind of high level concepts and then builds on them. So bear with this book and you will reap the rewards of staying with it. So how much is this book? Well, this book is going to be sold on all sorts of shop fronts over the world. I'm based in the UK. I'm sure that this is sold in places like Amazon in various countries. Not a sponsor, by the way, although it wouldn't be cool if Amazon sponsored some of my videos. But as an indicative price, this is currently on the UK Amazon shopfront. At the current time of filming, of course, prices will go up and down. It doesn't include shipping or anything like that. But this is currently on sale at £56.99 for a hardcover. But you can get the Kindle edition, which has colour images, for £57.31 at the time of recording. So yeah, I think you get a lot of bang for your buck. And yes, it is, I think, quite a niche topic, but it covers a lot of different areas, a lot of different sort of industries, and I think that it will be of interest to a lot of different people. So let me know what you think to this book in the comments, especially if you read any of Mark's other books, especially if you read this book. I'd really be interested to know what you think down below. I'm sure other people would be too. If you like this video, hit that like. If you want to subscribe to see more content like this, then please do subscribe, hit that notification bell. All really helps my channel out and I appreciate it very much. Otherwise, stay safe, happy picking, and I will see you all next time.